Great. So welcome again to the BMRC's Intro to Archiving Workshop Part 1. My name is Marsha Walker McWilliams, Executive Director of the Black Metropolis Research Consortium, and I would like to take a moment to introduce everyone to your workshop facilitator, Tanya Calvin. Tanya Calvin joined the BMRC as the Community Engagement Archivist in June 2020. Tanya is responsible for connecting with the BMRC's member institutions and doing outreach with the larger Black community in Chicago to advise them with best practices and collections practices. By working directly with different Black communities in Chicago, Tanya closes the gap between archives and the communities they serve. Tanya was a Black Studies and Latinx and Latin American Studies double major at Amherst College, where they also worked as an assistant in the Robert Frost Library Archives and Special Collections for 3 years. Tanya was selected for the Lane Research Fellowship for Creative Artists with Frost Library, where they researched gaps in the Amherst College Archives and Special Collections pertaining to Black, Mexican, and queer identities. In the summer of 2019, they worked as an intern in the Archives Department of the Chicago History Museum through the Robert F. Smith Internship Program with the National Museum of African American History and Culture. There, Tanya processed the backlog visual materials collection connected to the Reverend Joseph H. Jackson papers and created a Google Arts and Culture online exhibit showcasing the collections. They look forward to pursuing their master's in library and information science while staying based in Chicago. When Tanya is not working in archives and special collections, they are a poet and performance artist. They self-publish zines that cover topics like mental health issues, relations between Black and Mexican cultures, and Black resistance to racial oppression. Tanya also enjoys live music, cooking, and walking along the shore of Lake Michigan. And I'll also add that in general, Tanya is pretty awesome. So everyone is in for a treat.
Thank you, Marsha. That's very sweet of you. Thank you all for being here. I'm really excited to give this workshop. This is my first time giving a workshop like this, but I've been building up a lot of knowledge about archives through my experience, and I'm excited to share that with you all today. So I'm gonna share my screen, and then I am also going to turn off my camera so that my internet works a little better and I don't get cut out. Let me start from the beginning. All right. So before I get started and jump right in, because it's a very long presentation, I want to note that this presentation and workshop is full of information and it can be overwhelming, but the slides are all going to be shared as well as a resource packet with more information about each section. And then there will also be breaks for questions in between each section. So if you have a question that comes up while I'm presenting, just drop it in the chat. And at the end of each section, I'll take a 5-minute break and look over them. If I can't get to every question, I'll make a note of them and try to address them in the follow-up email. I also wanted to remind everybody of what I said in the emails where I confirmed this workshop when you registered about the Archival Toolkit raffle that we're hosting. The BMRC, with a community survey we ran a couple months ago, gave away 10 toolkits. This time we're giving away 15 Archival toolkits filled with supplies to start off your archiving project. If you would like to enter, you can fill out the, sorry, I don't know what that was about. You can fill out the evaluation form that I'm going to be linking at the end of the workshop, and it'll ask for your contact information, but that's going to be separated from your feedback. So definitely be honest. And I believe that's it. So I'm going to go ahead and get started. I'm going to get started with some definitions first so that we're all on the same page about some things. To define archives, I want to say that they're the natural result and recorded memory of a person's, family's, organizations, or institutions' activities. This basically just means that we collect documentation about things that people do, activities that they partake in, and significant events that happen. Archival materials are unique and preserved because of their continuing value, and I'll talk about how to determine that value. And archives are arranged and described based on who created them and what original organizational order they're in if they're already organized. This arrangement is just organizing materials into groupings within the general collection. And then your descriptions or finding aids and catalog records will reflect the arrangement or organization. The amount of detail you put in this description is going to depend on how much material you have, what your management needs and resources are, as well as the needs of the people that you want to share your collection with. And I'll get into description and arrangement in the next sections. First, I'm going to talk about appraisal, which is just a fancy way of talking about the process of evaluating materials for their value and deciding which of them you want to keep permanently. You can determine this value based off either the actual record itself and its physical manifestation or the information in the record. For example, you might have a set of like 25 cassette tapes that you don't necessarily want to keep all of them because you don't think that cassette tapes are necessarily super significant. But if they all have oral histories in them, then you would want to preserve those or at least transfer them to another kind of record. And so deciding whether the record itself, like the actual material or the information in the material is more important, you can decide whether you want to make a copy or digitize it and keep that instead and get rid of the original. Determinations of value are made typically at the series level, sometimes at the item level if you have the capacity for it. When I say series level and item level, I'm talking about this chart right here, which is basically just how archival collections are divided. FONS is a fancy word for the name of the whole collection. Collections are divided into series or categories. Those series or categories are sometimes divided into subgroups or subseries. Within those, you have files or folders, and within the folders, you have individual items. So if you have a very large collection, you're probably only going to want to go through box by box at a time and even series by series, so like a set of boxes at a time. It can take a lot of time to go through item by item, and it's not always necessarily beneficial. Something that is really helpful in the beginning of your process is creating a collection development policy, because this can help you decide which items you want to keep. Typically, these are very simple statements that talk about the scope of your collection, so what you already know that you have, the scope of collections in your community. If you're doing a family history collection, you can even go as far as to asking your family members what kind of documents and photographs they have, so you have an idea. You also want to think about your collection goals, whether you're collecting to keep things on your own, if you're collecting to eventually make a donation, or if you want to have some other kind of transfer agreement with a repository like a library or museum. You should definitely think about that. And then you also want to think about your audience and what their needs are. Typically, people create collections because they want to share them with people. And so you should consider what their needs are and write that into your policy. This doesn't have to be super extensive. It can just be a couple pages, even just one page with these 4 paragraphs, but it can be really important in the long run. I have 2 slides with lists of questions that you can ask while you're doing your appraisal. I tried to put them in an order that makes sense, so bear with me. The first question I ask myself typically is how much material there is and how much space there is to keep it in. If you have more boxes than you have space for, realistically, then you're going to need to know about how many boxes of stuff you need to get rid of. And that can be really helpful so that you're not overshooting or undershooting when you're doing your appraisals. You want to consider when the records or materials were created and how old they are. Sometimes age can be more of a challenge than a benefit. If something is really old and fragile, you're going to need to budget more to preserve it. And if you don't have that budget, you might want to consider having some kind of transfer agreement with someone or a repository that does have the budget for it. I want to note that we're planning on hosting an event in the next couple months about how to make donations and have other kind of transfer agreements with repositories. So you should definitely be on the lookout on the BMRC website and social media for that information. You want to ask yourself why the material was created and what was or is important about the information or the person who created it. You should consider the context and how it is or is not relevant to those collection goals I've been mentioning. You want to ask yourself what type of material it is. Some materials are more useful and have more information than others. For example, correspondence like letters and journals and diaries usually have more narrative information about people's lives than invoices or worksheets. You can also ask yourself if this kind of material can be studied. For example, sometimes there are evidences of technological advancement. You might actually want to keep those cassette tapes because they're evidence of the advances of magnetic computing and storage, or something might have a unique or curious physical feature, like a special texture, quality of the paper, or color or something, special type of binding. Those are all also reasons to consider. You want to ask what the quality and condition of the material is, if it's still readable, understandable, or clear. If you can't tell what something is or what's in it, it's hard to reason to keep it. You should especially look out for water damage, markings, warped records, underdeveloped photos, books with broken bindings, or books with missing pages, etc. The last one on this slide is asking if the records provide information about a significant person, place, or event that you want to represent. I put an asterisk next to the word significant because this is really going to depend on your collecting goals and your development policy and what you consider to be significant. A person who's archiving their family's collection is going to consider different things significant than a museum that specializes in African-American history and general history versus a particular family's history. So that collection development policy, like I said, is really handy. Some more questions to ask. I talked about knowing your audience. You should also know if the information in a record is going to be useful to that audience. It's definitely worthwhile to at least briefly survey your audience and know what they're interested in. Just having a casual conversation with family members is sometimes enough to know what kind of questions people have about family history. If you're doing organizational history, then you might want to consider the community that your organization has impacted, what they would be curious about, things like that. Next, you want to ask yourself if the collection has info about a time period, place, or group that is underdocumented. Materials that represent underdocumented people, places, and events are particularly important because they can contribute to completing narratives that are currently unfinished in the archives. You should ask if the records are rare or unique and if they can be found elsewhere. Widely distributed materials might already be archived somewhere else. You should ask if the material has aesthetic, artistic qualities. It's really up to you what that means. You want to ask if the record is unidentified, for example, photos, sound recordings, videos. It can be difficult to determine value without references to the people, places, or time periods that are in the material. You want to ask how it fits into your collection and how the records relate to others in that collection or community collections. Like I keep saying, the development policy is important. You should ask if the materials actually belong with you or with someone else. Based on your collection scope and goals and those of the collectors around you, you might want to consider giving materials to somebody else if you don't want to keep it for yourself. For example, I once found a bunch of family photos of a relative of mine who's kind of distant, and I didn't really think it was fair to keep them, so I made copies and mailed the originals to her. Lastly, you should consider how much it'll cost to preserve the materials and whether you should make copies instead. Archivist Melissa Manning once wrote that the cost of retention can sometimes override our desire to keep something. Preserving materials can be really expensive, and if you have something that is already decaying really quickly, you want to consider if you actually have the money to keep it in a stable environment, because it's important to preserve them. And even though you want to keep them, it might be worth considering some kind of post-custodial agreement, which, like I said, we'll be talking about in an event in a couple months. If you are going to make copies, you should consider the quality of the copy you'd be making and whether it would be good enough for your audience's purposes. I know that was a lot, so I also wanted to give a list of common types of records that are kept and common types of records that are removed. The first slide is the ones that are kept. For organizations and institutions, it's really common to keep annual and special reports, meeting minutes, committee records. For everybody in general, it's common to keep financial records, correspondence like letters, postcards, cards, and emails. I should note with the financial record that it's generally summary financial data like budgets or financial statements, not really bills and receipts and things like that. Topical or subject files are really common. I think it's more common to keep them digitally these days, but there are a lot of collections that have folders full of newspaper clippings, photos, articles, things like that about a specific topic or subject. We often keep photos, sound recordings, and videos or films. We also keep printed items like photocopied journal articles, newspaper clippings, reports, and other widely circulated materials. These are particularly important or are specifically important if they are by and or about the creator, not necessarily if they're just general publications. Printed items like monographs, newsletters, brochures, and posters also are often kept. Personal journals and diaries, unpublished manuscripts, and certificates can also be really telling about somebody's work. These are common types of records that are removed. The most common is materials that are not related to the organization, institution, family, or person you're trying to represent. You're going to need to know a little bit of the context of the functions and actions of these people or groups to understand what is and isn't related or important. Materials that fall outside of your collection scope, like I said, you might want to consider giving that somewhere else. Materials that are heavily damaged can be hard to keep because you might need to pay to restore them, and that can be really costly. And preservation for materials that are already decaying is more expensive than materials that are in good condition. Printed material that is readily available elsewhere, especially if it's readily available elsewhere in your target audience. Like I said, non-summary financial records like account statements, purchase orders, vouchers, old bills and receipts, canceled checks, etc. You don't really want to keep old housekeeping records, just like routine memos about meeting times, reminders about things. Those generally can be discarded. You want to get rid of duplicate material. If you have lots of something and you want to keep more than one, you should keep at most two. You're never really going to need more than two of anything. And then lastly, materials with sensitive data. People are usually talking about Social Security and tax ID numbers, credit card and bank account numbers, forms of identification, medical records, and contact info. But I also mean information that is potentially private or some people would consider embarrassing. As an example, sometimes archivists find materials in collections of really famous people who were thought to be heterosexual, but they find some letters or some notes indicating that they actually were homosexual or bisexual or any other sexuality. And you have to decide how you're going to share that information, if you are going to share that information, and if you're going to make it public, especially considering that there might be reasons that people, while they were alive, might have decided not to share that information. Some final notes about appraisal. New records can also be valuable. So newly created materials in our communities can shape the future narrative that you want to help create. So that's definitely something to think about. Records that represent gaps in your collection when considering your development policy are particularly important versus records that have info already heavily in your collection. So if you already have a lot of financial information about one member of your family and you want to make room for different kinds of information about that member, then you want to consider getting rid of some of those financial records because you already have so many. You want to come up with a plan for what to do with materials once they're removed. One option is to send them somewhere else, like I said, to a repository if you have that kind of relationship with an organization or institution that you trust. Will you discard them? Usually people shred or recycle them. Professional repositories have processes for incinerating materials, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend that you try that at home. And then you could also consider returning them to the person who created them if it wasn't you. You should definitely keep a written record of your decisions, of what you've reviewed and why you decided to keep or discard or transfer items. And you can do small rehousing efforts, which basically just means putting things in new folders, putting things in new boxes. If you can afford archival grade materials, that's really great. But there are options for short-term storage if you can't afford that. In the resource packet I'm distributing following this event, there is a spreadsheet with links and prices for archival grade materials and materials that aren't archival grade, but would still be handy if you're just thinking short-term. And then you definitely want to take notes about the info you find in materials for cataloging purposes later. And in the description section, I'll get into why. That's the end of the first section. So I want to pause here for questions. I'll see if there are any in the chat, and I'll give it a minute in case anybody wants to type anything in. Okay, well, if nobody has any questions, I will keep moving right along. Now I'm going to talk about processing, which is just the archivist's way of saying the process of arranging and organizing a collection and prepping it for storage and eventual access. This just means putting things in order and making sure people can actually look through them and it's not totally in disarray. Some basics, you always want to wear dirty or old clothes when you're first processing materials. Have nitrile gloves and surgical masks on hand. Oftentimes, these materials have been sitting in basements or attics for a really long time, and materials are prone to pests and pest feces, waste and debris, or even sometimes there's substances that you don't even know what it is. If something seems particularly important and you think you want to keep it, you can try to clean it. Otherwise, you generally should just remove the items that are dirty and dispose of them appropriately. If they're really important to you, like you have somebody's only manuscript of this book that they wrote and you really want to preserve it, you could consider finding the funding and capacity for hiring somebody to restore and conserve that material. This idea of more product, less process is just an archivist term that stands for the idea of processing collections quicker versus in more detail for larger collections. That just means when you have dozens and dozens of boxes, you want to pick a process that is reasonable for going through it at a reasonable amount of time versus going through every single item in detail. A lot of archival repositories have issues with backlogs where they acquire so many materials, but they don't have good processes for arranging the collections, and they end up just sitting for a really long time while being processed. So if you have a large collection, you want to consider going through it more quickly versus in more detail. If you have a smaller collection though, then you definitely can consider going through it item by item and getting that detail, because eventually it'll help you find items in the long run. The first step I always take with processing is establishing categories or those series I was talking about. And then after that, I organize within them by chronological or alphabetical order. Oftentimes we'll have each box or a set of boxes have their own categories and go from there. The more information you can put in a searchable description Word doc or even a PDF, the easier it'll be to find items. You should at least have a general inventory, if not a finding aid, and I'll get into what a finding aid is in a little while. However you choose to process, definitely do it consistently. It's really time consuming to go back and start over if you change your mind. So definitely think about how you're going to process before you get started. And lastly, if you have a repository in mind, you can ask them what order they prefer, and you can arrange and describe recording that to prepare. And with religious institutions, you can usually check to see if the denomination has a records management program and follow that. I've been talking a lot about arrangement, and when I say arrangement, I just mean the way materials are organized. How materials are organized determines how accessible they are and helps you keep track of where stuff is. There's a difference between physical arrangement and intellectual arrangement. Physical arrangement describes where items are actually stored and kept, and this is usually decided by what kinds of items there are. For example, photos need cold storage, so you would keep those separate from papers. Intellectual arrangement is how items are organized in their descriptions, like the inventories or finding aids. So as an example, you might find a box of love letters that your parents wrote each other when they were first dating, and you want to keep both the photos and the letters that are in the box, but you know that you have to keep photos in cold storage. So what you would do is you would separate the photos from the letters, keeping them in their original order, house them separately, but in the inventory, you would note that they're in the same series or category, they're just in different locations. And that would be totally an appropriate way to describe and store the items because you're being worried about preservation, which is the most important thing. Some definitions of fancy archival terms that are pretty simple. The term provenance just is an idea that means we keep materials from the same creators together and separate them from other collections. This is an idea that's really being challenged by more contemporary archivists because of how many materials are actually stolen through colonization and other oppressive systems. So the provenance of a certain collection might be considered to be a creator, but that creator might actually be somebody who colonized a land and stole all of the materials. And so they're not really the creator. And that's why this term is getting a lot of pushback. Original order means that we preserve or recreate the order that materials are already in if they're already organized. Sometimes materials are in disarray and they have no organization at all. And in that case, you want to rearrange them. But if they already clearly are in some kind of order, you want to keep them and respect the creator's decision. Just to go over this chart again, like I said, collections are divided into series or categories. Series are divided sometimes into sub-series or subcategories. Within those, you have files or folders, and in each folder, you have individual items. Some more definitions, the difference between records, papers, and collections. Records are materials from an organization or institution. Papers are materials from an individual or family. And a collection is made up of materials that are intentionally put together regardless of who made them. For example, if you're making a collection about the history of HIV and AIDS treatment, you wouldn't necessarily keep materials from separate creators separate. You would keep them together in a collection because that's your intended purpose for that collection. I'm going to go over 5 basic steps of processing that hopefully are helpful if you really have to do the most basic things. First, you should look through and skim records briefly just to see if there's already some kind of organization established. If there is, you can just leave it as is and move on to preservation and description. But if things aren't organized, you definitely want to pick those categories and series that I've been talking about. I gave some examples on this slide of categories and series that are often used. Sometimes they're made up of types of materials like photos, correspondence, financial records, books and publications, newspaper clippings, certificates, and manuscripts. Sometimes they're divided up by occupations or time periods, and sometimes we divide them up by subjects or topics. So it really depends. You have to know your collection and, like I said, skim through it so you have a general idea of what's in it and you can determine from there. Third, you're going to separate your materials into those categories once you've decided them. Physically removing harmful clips or enclosures, things that are not archival grade. If you're moving them into archival grade materials, like I said, there's that spreadsheet that you can find them at. But if not, you can also typically just use regular file folders and storage boxes with a top, always with a top. Those aren't going to be good for long-term preservation, so you should definitely think long-term about finding funding to buy archival grade materials. These are some examples of file folders, a record storage carton, and envelopes for negatives that you can get from the Gaylord Archival website. Fourth, you want to organize materials within those boxes and folders in chronological, reverse chronological, or alphabetical order. If you have a bunch of letters that are dated, obviously chronological makes the most sense. But if you have undated letters and you only have names and you want to go by alphabetical. And then lastly, you want to label the folders and boxes always with pencil and create a general inventory of items based on how they're organized. I made some examples of how you can label a folder and a box. Generally, these labels should include the name of the collection, the title of the series, the box and or folder number, and then the dates. If you don't know what the dates are, then you should definitely note that it's undated. You should make note about your decisions about how you rearrange items if you're going to. Note any contextual info you find in the materials when going through them. Write down what order the materials seem to be in originally if they're in any order. Definitely remind yourself by writing down where you store items so you don't forget. You should know items that need restoration, conservation, or special preservation. Restoration means, like it sounds, restoring things to their original form if they've been damaged. Conservation means changing a material to help conserve it over time, but not necessarily restoring it to its original condition. And then preservation is just the general process of making sure things don't decay even further. So some items might need more intense versions of these processes than others. And you might, if you have particularly fragile books, for example, that are falling apart and you want to restore them, then you might want to think about looking for funding through grants or something like that. And then you should also write down any items that you find particularly valuable or of special interest. This might take, like I've been talking about, knowing your audience and what they would be curious about. Some processing do's and don'ts. Like I've been saying, work consistently, and you should keep a log of any decisions you make while following the same conventions for naming files that you've already established. So don't start changing the way you name files halfway through. It's good to be consistent. If you can, without cracking them, unfold or uncurl pages and flatten them gently, that's good. If they're going to crack though, if they're really fragile, then you should probably just leave it as is. You should remove all rubber bands and metal clasps, including staples and metal paper clips. Instead, to keep items together, you can use a folder or a folded piece of acid-free paper. Even if you're really desperate, a plastic paper clip will do. You should either photocopy or put acid-free papers around highly acidic items. These are typically newspaper clippings and telegrams and other older paper materials that are made out of not so great ingredients. You should remove papers and photos from binders, folders, plastic sleeves, and other common office supplies if you know that they're not of archival quality. Archival quality plastic sleeves, at least, will typically be made out of one of these three polys: polyester, polypropylene, or polyethylene. I'll get into more detail about enclosures in the preservation section. And then you should place fragile items in acid-free protected sleeves and folders, which I'll also talk about. When handling photographs or film, you should always wear natural gloves because fingerprints can be really damaging. And if you have photos that are taped onto a piece of paper and you want to get it off that piece of degrading paper, then you can try with an X-Acto knife to take the paper off the adhesive, but don't try to take the actual adhesive off the photo because it's probably going to rip and ruin the photo overall. If you're really worried about things being stuck to pieces of paper, then that's another reason to think about contacting a conservator. You never want to use Post-its or other adhesive labels for boxes and folders, especially not on the materials themselves, because they'll decay over time and make it worse. And last, don't panic. Processing a collection is exactly that, a process. You won't know everything at the beginning, so it's definitely possible that you'll make a mistake and have to go back and fix it. It's a good idea to take notes and think through how you're going to process before you actually start. That's why I keep saying that. Some last processing notes, organized by level first, thinking of that chart I've been showing, and see what you have the capacity for. Arranging by item is not always necessary and is really time consuming. You should always consider and learn about the context of the materials before you start, because this will help you decide how to organize items. That might take a little bit of research, but it goes a long way. You should group unidentified items together. Sometimes you can guess dates based off of what kind of material it is or what format it's in. Even with photos, you can often look and see what clothes people are wearing, and based on the trends at the time, determine what time period it's from. For example, sometimes it's really obvious when photos are from the 80s, and you can usually note that it's a guess, but just right, like circa 1980s. You want to use clear, relevant labels for each subgroup so that you know how to refer to them later. And don't overpack folders or boxes, because you can cause more damage to the materials, or if boxes become too heavy, then they definitely can become a hazard to people trying to move them in and out of storage. And I think that's it for this section. So I will see if anybody has questions in the chat. Krista says, have a few pictures that need restoration because they've been bent and they're cracked. Yeah, so, and lots of old photos of Black photo albums, book paper on backs. Yeah, so if you have a lot of photos that are in Black photo albums that are stuck, the photos are stuck to the paper, then you don't necessarily want to try going through the process of taking them all out, because that could be really tedious, and doing it over long periods of time, you could be prone to mistakes and ripping the paper. But if you're really concerned long-term, then that might be a reason to reach out to a conservator and see what they can do about removing it. Those services can be kind of pricey, but if you can find funding for it and pool money together, it's really worth it. Another option for photos that are in photo albums that you think will degrade is to digitize them. I'm going to be hosting a workshop about digitizing and digital archiving sometime in late August or early September. I haven't announced it yet. But I'll be talking about how to do that. And digitizing or scanning or taking photos of photos is a really good way to make sure you can preserve them over time without leaving them exposed to decay. And then, yeah, for photos that are bent and cracked, contacting somebody to restore it or a conservator is really your best option. Yeah, digitizing is cool. Very long process, but totally worth it in the end. Okay, so I think if nobody has any other questions about this section, I will move on to the next section. I'm going to be talking about describing archives, which just means accurately representing info about materials. Descriptions will typically do 4 things. First, they'll identify materials and name what they are. They'll explain the context and who created them. They'll explain the processes and activities that made the materials, like what actually was happening and the reason they were produced. And then also they'll talk about how the collection was processed. These descriptions must be accurate and accessible enough to be looked at instead of physically looking through items, because typically researchers and your audience members will be looking through these descriptions before they come in. And so they need to have a good enough idea of how they can access collections and what's actually in them. I'm going to talk about the difference between catalog records and finding aids. First, catalog records list basic info about the collection and its content, and these are referred to when people are deciding which collection to look at. This is an example of the Ralph Ellison papers catalog record, and you can see it has the title, the date, the extent or how big the collection is, where the collection is, and then also just a general summary of what's in it. Finding aids, on the other hand, list individual groupings within those collections and show where they're located. And these are referred to when people are deciding which materials to look at within the collection they've chosen. So first, people will look at the catalog records and decide what couple of collections they want to look at, and then they'll look through the finding aids of those collections and decide which items that they're interested in, or even boxes and series number. These finding aids should typically include box and volume numbers, box titles, the number of boxes or volumes in a series, dates, and important notes. I'll talk more about what finding aids entail in a couple slides. Access points are just a way of talking about the subject headings or tags on catalog records that are used when searching through finding aids. These often include names, places, subjects, or topics, occupations, functions, and activities, or even what kind of material it is. So in a database, all the photos might be tagged photo and you could search by photo, or all the letters could be tagged letter and you could search by letter. That's what I mean by documentary forms. On the right is a list of subject headings from the Library of Congress list. And these are from the section under African American. And as you can see, they're different topics. And if you were to Google African American astrology or search it in the Library of Congress catalog records, then every finding aid that is tagged with that would come up and it would show you the catalog records that you can look into the finding aid from there. I'm going to talk about the basic parts of a finding aid. Finding aids can be really extensive, and I'm not going to talk about every detail. An example of an annotated finding aid is on the SAA website, and it's also linked in the resource packet that I'm handing out at the end of the workshop. So first, you just have the name and location of where the collection is. Your name, if it's just you, you can include contact information if you want people to be able to reach out to you. You want to give the collection a title, just a word or a phrase, and remember the difference between records, papers, and collections. You want to include the dates of the collection. There's a difference between what's called inclusive and bulk dates. Inclusive and bulk dates just mean that if you have a collection of letters that are from 1980 to 2015, but only one of those letters is from 1980, then your inclusive dates would be 1980 to 2015, but your bulk dates would probably be about 2000 to 2015. So it's dependent on what's everything that's included or what most of the materials include. You should also note if you're guessing or making approximations. The extent talks about how much material there is and what kinds of materials are in the collection. So you can usually measure, archivists typically measure by linear cubic feet, but if you have a smaller collection, you can typically do the number of boxes or other containers. And again, you should note if you're guessing. Definitely write down the name of who created the materials, the person, family, organization, or institution. The scope and content note is just a general description of the materials and activities that are reflected in them. You can often find some of the access points I was talking about earlier here, as well as dates. The conditions of access and use vary, but they generally talk about access restrictions and details about them. If there are no restrictions and people can pretty much freely come to look at materials, then definitely note that. Otherwise, there might be limitations like physical access if materials are stored in an offsite location and you need to go drive to pick them up. That's something you should definitely indicate in a finding aid. Also, if materials are fragile and they actually can't be physically handled, then you should indicate that people are going to be getting a copy or a scan. Technical access restrictions are often things like needing special equipment or software. And then there's also conditions governing reproduction and use, which just talks about if you want to use the material in some kind of other thing that you're creating, like a publication, you want to pay attention to copyright restrictions. So if you don't know what the copyright laws are pertaining to your collection, just make a general note that copyright could apply so that people are aware and can do their own research from there. The description control just talks about who wrote the finding aid, when they wrote it, and how they wrote it, what rules they used, and then also information about who edited the finding aid if it's been revised. The admin or biohistory note just talks about the person or organization who made the collection, anybody who managed the collection or used it. For families, you typically want to record full and married names, people who were married, the people who started the family, where people lived, important relationships. For individual people, you should note the dates or approximations of the dates of birth and death, where they lived, if they had any type of education, formal education, what their life work was or career, things like that. And then lastly, the inventory should be based off of how you organize your materials and can be as detailed as the organization is. So if you only organized by series and you didn't even go through each box, then you can just make a finding aid where you list the series titles and not even the box titles. But if you do go through box by box and each box has a title, then you should list those box titles in the finding aid for sure. Like I said, I know that was a lot of information. So if you want more info about what finding aids are and what they contain, you can look on the link that's in the resource packet to the SAA website. This is the finding aid that I made for the Joseph H. Jackson collection that Marsha was talking about in the intro. As you can see, it has the title, the person or organization who created the collection. This publisher information is actually the info about the repository. It says publisher because they technically published the finding aid. There's the bio note, the physical description, just saying how much is in the collection, the dates, the scope and contents, and then it also has the inventory or contents list. And when I processed this collection, I only gave really the boxes detailed titles, so the inventory is listed by box. It was only, it was a very small collection, so it wasn't really necessary to go folder by folder in detail. And even if it was a larger collection, it would have been very tedious to go through folder by folder. Generally, box titles is enough. Some other notes about describing, like with everything else, you want to base the level of your description on your capacity and how materials are organized. The description doesn't necessarily have to match how materials are physically organized, but you should be sure to note where you can find items. I talked about that a little bit earlier. The most common source of info for your descriptions is in the materials themselves, so pay attention when you're going through them and take notes. You can create a collection level description if you really are in a time pinch and just write a general scope of what's in the materials, when they were created, why, and who created them. And then lastly, the most important thing is that your audience knows what's in your collection and how they can access the materials. This will help them decide what they do and don't want to come in and see. I added this slide about critical cataloging thanks to a lot of information and knowledge I gained from critical cataloging webinars by Trishani Pereira and Deirdre Thompson. So 100% credit to them for this slide. They are involved in a progressive library movement that they call critical librarianship, which they define as a growing body of library and information science scholarship drawing on critical theory, an online community that organizes in-person meetings, and an informal Twitter discourse space active since 2015. They use the hashtag CritLib. And critical cataloging is all based on the idea that we generally now accept as archivists that cataloging is not neutral because archiving is very heavily based in colonialism, and therefore the cataloging that comes out of it cannot be neutral by definition. For this reason, it's important to think about all identities that are connected to materials, including gender, sexuality, race, ethnicity, geographic location, ability, religion, etc. An example I can give of this was the debate about whether to name the Phyllis Wheatley Peters papers that actual name or the Phyllis Wheatley papers. This is because Phyllis Wheatley, if you don't know, was an enslaved Black woman who was kidnapped when she was a girl, but she was the first Black person, I believe, not even Black woman, but Black person to be published. She was a poet. And there was some debate over whether her paper should be named after the name given to her by her slave owner, which was Phyllis Wheatley, or her married name of the husband that she chose to marry and got the name Phyllis Wheatley Peters. With the idea of critical cataloging, it makes way more sense to name them the Phyllis Wheatley Peters papers because she chose to marry that man and that's her chosen name. But this is something that people might not necessarily consider if they're not thinking about her place in the world as an enslaved Black woman. Furthering this thought, you want to consider who's in charge of your descriptions and writing your finding aids, and who should be in charge, who should be in leadership when making those descriptions. If you're making a finding aid for a collection that is about somebody outside of your community, then maybe you should actually hire a consultant and have somebody else who is from that community do that work. Always pay them for that work, but again, if your expertise isn't the one that should be consulted, then it's generally not a good idea for you to be doing the descriptions. We should always center the lives and experiences of the most marginalized and underrepresented groups and people. And for this reason, we add content warnings for triggering or harmful materials in collections, and we make them publicly visible. Going along with this, we remove harmful language from descriptions, because offensive terms do not belong in catalog records. Catalog records don't have enough space to describe why those words or phrases are being used, and people that are from certain marginalized communities have to be exposed to them when researching, and it's not fair. And so we just remove those language. But we also keep in mind that we should use inclusive language of words that communities actually use, so that when they're searching by words that are familiar to them, they can actually find materials. I'm including the link in the slide and in the resource packet to a list of statements on bias in library and archives description that a lot of librarians and archivists came up with. And that's really good to refer to if you have more questions about critical cataloging and how your catalog records or finding aids can be more conscientious. Okay, I'm gonna stop again for questions. I'll open up the chat. Oh, John shared that Filmbox is a decent app to digitize old photos without sending out your negatives. That's a really good thing. I didn't know that there was an app like that. I'm gonna take a break to take a sip of water, and I'll wait in case anybody else has any other questions. Okay, great. If no one has any questions, I will move on. And now we're going to talk about preservation, which is arguably the most important part of archiving. It's important to state that bindings, paper, coatings, and adhesives all break down over time and can be damaged. This is because heat, moisture, and air pollutants speed up the decay of materials. They act as catalysts actually for the chemical reactions. But environmental control, proper housing, care, and maintenance can slow down this decay and protect materials from further physical damage. Some preventative measures to keep this decay from furthering include climate management, housing and protective enclosures, fire detection and suppression, security. When I say security, I don't really mean policing. I mean just knowing who has access to your collections and when. Disaster planning can include having a panic sheet or call list on hand, knowing what your insurance plans are and keeping them up to date, and then also keeping emergency supplies handy in case something happens. And then also handling procedures. If you're not sure what some of these mean, don't worry, I'm definitely going to explain them further. First, a building assessment for where your materials are is really important. You want to look at the temperature and make sure that it's stable, because fluctuations in temperature or humidity are actually really damaging. Typically, no higher than 68 to 70 degrees Fahrenheit is ideal. Relative humidity can be measured with what's called a hygrometer. They typically measure RH and temperature, and I put a link for a pretty cheap one that you can get from Office Depot in the resource packet. RH should typically be between 30 and 50%. Anywhere below 60 is generally good, but anything below 30 might be too cold. I should note that temperature and RH requirements are different for photos and film. They actually require cold storage. There's info on the National Park Service website about how to do cold storage. They have really good walkthroughs and videos that are helpful. Air quality, I'm basically talking about the fact that some materials like paint, wood, negatives, even some prints, release gaseous chemicals, and we should dispose of or separate those items. If you notice that things are smelly, that's generally a really big problem. And if you want to restore them, you can look into that, but smelly materials are typically bad news. So to protect your air quality, you want to check your air filtration system and make sure the air is clean, and minimize indoor pollutants like cleaning supplies. Even sometimes copy machines can create what's called ozone and build up pollutants. And use quality enclosures. So if you can afford archival grade boxes and folders, then that's awesome. Light exposure causes embrittlement, yellowing, and fading, and color prints are more sensitive to this. So I'll give some notes of how to limit that. I talked a little bit about security, water and fire protection. Lifting things 3 to 4 inches off the ground on shelves is good practice. Making sure your smoke detector works, making sure there's a drain in the area if possible. Emergency preparedness is important. Conducting a walkthrough to evaluate your building and seeing where there are risks for damage like leaks, broken windows, unstable foundations, blocked drainage, etc. And last, but definitely not least, housekeeping and pest management is really important. I'm going to repeat this again, but archivists really never bring food or drink around materials. They attract pests, and if you have to bring them around materials, make sure you're taking out the trash every day before you leave. Housing is just an archivist's way of saying where materials are stored. There are different layers of protection that include sleeves, envelopes, and folders that go into boxes. The boxes go into furniture, which goes into rooms in a building. And I'm going to get into the difference between paper and plastic. So paper archival materials are great because they're opaque and limit light exposure. Plus you can write on them with pencil and easily label them. They're inexpensive and lightweight. Some standards, I say standards because the terms archival and acid-free actually don't mean anything unless they're used with one of these 3 standards. The first one, you don't really need to know the extent of what these mean, but the first one is that it passes the PAT, which is the photographic activity test, and just means that the paper or plastic treats photo materials well. Lignin is a material that creates acids and peroxides and is really bad for decay. So if you can make sure that materials are lignin free, that's awesome. Cotton and linen materials are naturally lignin free, so that's an option as well. And then if it talks percentages, cellulose 87% or higher is good, or if it's 100% cotton or rag, that's great as well. Plastic materials are awesome for viewing because they're transparent and smooth. However, in higher humidity levels, they stick to photos and prints because of the emulsion on the front. Make sure plastic housing, like the paper, passes PAT. Make sure it doesn't have any coatings or adhesives or any chlorides. If it says it's made out of PVC, it is definitely bad news. I talked about these polys. Polyester is generally better than polyethylene or polypropylene. However, polypropylene and polyethylene are typically more affordable. I was talking about photos and things with adhesives on the back. So sometimes archivists will buy plastic fabrics. These are some of the brand names on the screen, and these are just little fabrics that you can attach on the backs of adhesives so that they don't stick to other areas. If you do have a lot of photos that were in scrapbooks and are already removed and they're sticking everywhere, it might be a good idea to invest in some of these plastic fabrics so you can stick them on the back and make sure nothing is getting damaged further. There are paper folders and envelopes, which are inexpensive. And if you need hundreds and hundreds of folders, you can typically buy folder stock and just, they have perforations and you can just cut them out and fold them yourself. They're easy to use and space efficient. Some standards or guidelines for you is that you should never put more than 10 items per folder because otherwise you'll be overpacking them. You want to put similar materials and materials that are similar sizes in each folder if possible. And then you want to make sure that items are slightly smaller than the folder so nothing is hanging out. You can use what's called interleaving or subfolders, which basically just means putting pieces of paper in between materials if you think that they might stick together. Plastic sleeves and envelopes are great for documents, photos, or film that are especially fragile. They're a little bit more expensive and are more specialty items, but if you have a lot of photos and film and fragile documents, it would be worth the investment. They're pretty easy to use and are transparent, so good for viewing, and they come in various sizes. So if you see this one on the top here, comes in different sizes for different paper sizes. This one is made especially for documents. This is a standard 8.5 by 11 sheet protector that you can buy. I'm pretty sure you can buy polypropylene sheet protectors from Office Depot, but the details about that are in the resource packet. And then this, some people asked about film care. B&H Photo and Video has good sleeves for negatives that are really good to put in specifically PVC-free binders, but binders are good. Like I said, polyester, polypropylene, or polyethylene are great archival standards. Make sure they don't have any PVC or adhesives and that they pass the PAT. For boxes, you want to use the same standards as paper. Something called slumping or shifting happens when boxes are only halfway full. If you can imagine, if something is only halfway full, things are going to move around inside of it, but that can actually be really damaging to materials and papers can get warped or bent over time. So a good solution to this that a lot of archivists would use is just taking an empty folder and folding it in half and placing it in the empty space so that it spreads out and takes up the rest of that space. Boxes do come in different sizes though. So if you have a lot of folders, you might consider something like this, a record storage carton. If you only have like 15 to 20 folders, then a flip top box like this would be good. And if you have materials that are odd sizes, then these flat boxes are really good for storage. You don't want to overcrowd items like I was saying before, because that can be even more damaging, and you should always store them upright and not on their sides. Shelves and cabinets are typically the most affordable and stable for storage. Like I said, you should look out that things are lifted at least 3 to 4 inches off the ground in case of flooding. Handling just talks about the way people are actually physically touching your materials, and careless handling can cause further damage. So you definitely want to make sure you have written instructions for whoever is touching your materials, whether researchers, family members, or even just yourself. Make sure you have enough light, space, and time when handling materials. If you're in a time crunch and it's dark and you're in a corner, that's really not a good time to be handling materials because you're more prone to damaging them and making a mistake. Always wash your hands before handling materials. Don't put on lotion after, even if your hands are dry, because the oils will damage them. And if you're still worried about your hands not being clean enough, then you should wear nitrile gloves. Consider making digital or paper copies for browsing for things that are falling apart, especially. And I say use both hands and supports like cradles and weights, specifically if you have a lot of old books that are falling apart. It can be really good to invest in a set of cradles and weights so that you're not damaging them when you're opening them. A trick that I use if I don't have the money for cradles for books is I will put 2 firm pillows together and plop the spine in between them and open it that way. The key is to just make sure that the book spine is not cracking open and you're not ripping the spine at all. A lot of people asked about photos and film, and so I'm not going to get into super intimate details of how to store them, but I'm going to talk about the different kinds so that people are aware of what they might have, and then they can look up. You can look up what best storage is for these specific types. In the 1920s, safety film or acetate-based film became really popular because before that, people were using nitrate-based film, which was really flammable. Color film came in the 20th century with Kodachrome and Ektachrome. That's just called chromogenic color film. And then Polaroids, Fujifilm photos, and Polar color peel photos are dye diffusion transfers, and those came in the 1960s. All of these are susceptible to decay and should typically be placed in cold storage. However, with the dye diffusion transfer prints, you never want to freeze them because they will get damaged. Digital printing of photos in the 1980s came the CVS Kodak picture maker and the Canon portable printers, which typically make photos that are 4 by 6 inches, really no bigger than 8.5 by 14 inches. In 1983 came out the laser printers and photocopiers and Xerox machines. Those are just toners on uncoated paper that are fused into place, and those can really stick easily to adjacent surfaces, especially PVC. In 1987 came the most common one used for digital artists and amateurs, inkjet printers. These are just colored inks from nozzles onto supports. And there's lots of different kinds of printers, papers, and inks you can use. Some preservation do's and don'ts. Always keep materials in the cleanest, darkest, coolest, and least humid climate. Like I said, the ideal is a cool 68 to 70 degree Fahrenheit temperature with a low 30 to 50% low to mid level humidity and limited light exposure and water exposure, as well as limited fire risk. Some people will consider frost-free fridges for photos and film collections, or some will just monitor the relative humidity in the space. Like I said, the National Park Service website has more info about cold storage. 35mm slides and negatives should be moved out of cardboard and plastic boxes into paper boxes or polyethylene sleeves like the one I showed. You should inspect your storage spaces quarterly or annually because this will help you understand your preservation risks over longer periods of time. Even if you just have a chart with 4 columns where you track the date, time, temperature, and relative humidity level, that is a great start. You want to keep your doors and windows closed and lights off when no one is in the room. And like I've been saying, try to lift all materials at least 3 to 4 inches off the ground in case of flooding. Shelves are really great for this. To repeat, don't ever bring food or drinks near the materials. If you absolutely have to, make sure you throw them away outside of the room. Some people will use pH pens to test out folders and boxes to see if they're acid-free or not. If you're going to use a pH pen, make sure you're only using them on the folders and boxes, never on the actual materials themselves. Never use adhesives like tape for tears and breaks. Taping things together will cause greater decay over time. Instead, if things are really falling apart and you're worried about them, you might find the budget for contacting a conservator. On the last note is just what I was saying before about removing adhesives from paper using an X-Acto knife. This is dangerous, but if you're going to do it, like I've been saying, just remove the adhesive from the paper, not from the photo or print, because it will rip the back and damage the photo further. Some last notes about preservation. The more protective layers that I was talking about before, the better. For example, it's better to have folders in boxes than folders just lying around in a stack. You should assess the quality of all your folders and boxes and other enclosures. Even if you can't necessarily afford archival grade materials, you should at least know whether your materials are archival grade so that you can decide what long-term decay you're looking at. You should look out especially for brittle and stiff paper, sticky or greasy plastics, discoloration, distortion, or strong odors. You can consider a dry cabinet, buying a dehumidifier, or even they sell in some places dehumidifier packs for smaller storage spaces like cabinets. And generally, you want to just avoid extreme heat or cold. When you can, you should relocate collections to more stable areas. And something else some archivists will use are AD strips. There's something called vinegar syndrome, which all you need to know is when materials are decaying and they start to smell like vinegar. You can use AD strips, which are acid-base indicators, to put in with materials and take out later and see what color it is. All you need to know is that blue is good. And if the AD strip turns any color other than blue, then you have a problem. For lighting, you want to use LED lights and enclosures that are not see-through. And then you want to cover objects that are out but not in use. So if you're looking at a folder full of letters and you're going to step away for a while, make sure you close the folder and don't leave it exposed to light. Okay, so stopping second to last time for questions. I'm going to open the chat. Deanna asked, are cotton gloves okay to use or only natural gloves? Cotton gloves are okay. However, because oils can build up on them, you're going to have to wash them regularly. So that's another thing to keep in mind. And also sometimes if you're working with fragile documents and you're working with cotton, the fibers can accidentally rip the papers. If you're only working with photos, though, cotton gloves that you wash regularly will typically be okay. I'm going to take another sip of water, wait for a question. Okay, if there's no questions, I will move on to our very last section, which is much shorter than the other ones and just talks about providing access to collections. And this is really important to me because accessibility is really significant in archives. Archives are meant to be used by people and not kept from the communities they represent. Providing access to collections allows their historical narratives to be told accurately and also builds trust with communities, which should be really important to you. Descriptions and arrangement are part of accessibility, but archivists also make people aware of their materials and are clear about how they can be accessed. So that's a little bit of what I was getting into when I was talking about the descriptions. It's the responsibility of the archivist to make their target audience aware of their collections and how to access them. And there's a lot of different ways that people do this. I listed some here that include exhibits, publications and printed materials, public programs, commercial media and outreach, social media and the internet, and then also participating in other community events and initiatives is a great way to build relationships. And archivists are doing more educational programming to teach people about how collections are created, acquired, and organized, and just general information about what archivists do so that people know. Some ways that researchers and others users find collections include reading the summary note, reading the bio or historical note, using keyword searches with those access points that I was talking about, either the subject headings or the tags that include typically people, places, time periods, and topics or subjects. Because people are usually researching by the same kinds of standards, it's good on our end as archivists to standardize our access points so that people don't have to learn a new system every time they're learning about something. My last do's and don'ts charts for accessibility in archives. First, you want to provide info about why materials were created, why they were kept, the conditions they were created in, and how they were managed or changed. All those notes I was talking about you needed to take during the processing should be included in your information that you're sharing. Consider how people will use your materials and adapt your accessibility practices to their needs. I talked a little bit earlier about surveying your audience. This is really important. Knowing what they need and how they're going to be accessing their collections is key. You should always tell people that you have restricted materials, even if they can't access them. Keeping the information that you even have materials is generally bad protocol, especially because sometimes people can appeal for restricted materials for particular reasons. I say provide equitable, not equal access, because I want to consider people with disabilities and other limitations to access. If somebody is really far away, or if your building is not wheelchair accessible and somebody needs to see something and you don't typically provide scans, you might consider providing scans for them because they have that limited access. And that's not necessarily equal access that you would give to everybody, but it is equitable access. So that's important to think about as well. You want to provide copies for users who are far away if possible, and for people that want to look at items that are falling apart even more than other items. And of course, you want to think about physical accessibility like ramps, elevators, and wheelchair accessible tables. If you're providing resources online, which a lot of people are, you should think about having captions for videos, voice descriptions, other online accessibility options. And my only don't is to not charge fees for access to materials. And I only say this because sometimes when you're applying for grant funding, grant agencies will not give funding to repositories that are housing materials that they're charging for. That's just kind of a standard that a lot of grant agencies have. So that's something to think about. And then this last or second to last slide is just some ground rules for accessing materials. Like I was saying before, don't police people, but you should probably have people sign in just with the date, time in, time out, and name. Maybe their email if you want to be able to contact them. And that's mostly important for knowing when materials were accessed. If things are misplaced, it's good to know when the last time it was pulled out. So you can then ask who pulled it out, where they might have put it, things like that. I don't think it's really great practice to require photo ID for registration because not everybody has photo IDs, but that's up to you. No backpacks or large bags in the viewing areas. Some people say this out of mistrust and thinking that people will steal things. I say this because it's really easy to just swing a backpack and hit something and rip a page out of a book or something by mistake. We never use ink around materials, only ever use pencils. And like I've been saying, wash and dry your hands completely before handling anything. Use nitrile gloves when necessary, especially with photos and fragile items and sleeves. I talked about the weights and cradles for fragile books. And then I also talked about photocopying or scanning items that are particularly fragile, already ripping and falling apart, and you don't want them to be handled any more than they need to be. Okay, that's the end of my presentation. I know that was a ton of information, so I'm going to open the chat again for questions. Before I do, I want to remind everybody again of the archival toolkit raffle we're hosting. And if you're interested in that, I'm going to, in just a couple seconds, drop the link to the feedback form in the chat and you can fill that out. Like I said, it's going to ask for your contact info if you're entering the raffle, but that's going to be separated from your feedback. So please feel free to be honest. And in that follow-up email I'm sending after this, I'm also going to include the resource packet and my slides. Up here is my contact info if you have any further questions. For now, I will stop sharing my screen. And get back to the Zoom screen. Let's see these questions. What are local archiving events where people might be engaged? That's a good question. And actually a really good place to look out for that is on the BMRC social media. Marsha, I don't know if you have the quick links to our pages that you could drop, maybe just the Instagram. Our archivist, Allison Sutton, regularly posts archiving events that our members are hosting and that we're hosting so that you can keep up to date there and see what people are up to. I'm going to drop the link to the feedback form in the chat. So before everybody runs off, I want everybody to remember to fill that out. And like I said, enter the raffle if you want to. We're giving away 15 of these boxes and it's a really great opportunity to get some free supplies. So that's the link to the feedback form. Yeah, and I don't think anybody else has any questions. We finished a little early, which is awesome. If folks want the rest of their day back, you can totally have it. Thank you, everyone. I appreciate you all coming.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you, Krista.
Yeah, so that's a lot. Especially for us little newbies. So the question, you know, I'm getting a box. Is this the same box or is this a different box from what we got?
It is the same box that you are getting, Krista,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Well, and as we do it, we'll still have access to you guys to help us do it right, right?
Yeah, I mean, if you ever have any questions about the process that you're going through, you can email me. I know, Krista, you already have my contact information, so I'm happy to help. I don't know that I can extend the rest of the BMRC's team help, but it is definitely within my job description to be helping people with their archiving projects, yes.
Well, yeah, that's positive. Okay, so, my thing is just all these old photos I have, and I'm guessing I'm supposed to wrap them up. But do you guys have any restorative photo shops that you know of that you would suggest us to go to fix our photos that have splits in them and stuff like that?
I don't know any off the top of my head, but I could look into some different options for restoration services. They're typically offered to professional repositories, so I will have to look into how much it'll cost just for, just individual people trying to get things restored. But I can include that information in the resource packet and share that out afterwards.
Yeah, because I have a few split photos. They're not split in two. They just have those cracks down the center of them. And so I want to get that fixed so that, and then also I have a picture of my grandparents and my dad walking down, just strolling down the street somewhere in Chicago, and they're dressed to the nines. Is there could we find out where they are? Is it possible to get some help in, some Chicago historical, like when they were like in the 1940s, they were out on the street somewhere taking pictures. I think it's 47th Street, but I don't know.
Yeah, that's hard. I mean, it's definitely good to know the general area. Sometimes people will even things are so different now though that it's hard to tell, but sometimes what people will do is on Google Maps Street View and try to look around the area, but finding specific locations of where people were walking in photos, for example, can be really tricky because things change so much over time.
Okay, I just wondering if we had any connection to historians who could tell us, about, the Black neighborhoods and what went on in the Black neighborhoods. It may have the name of the guy who took the picture on it. I'm not sure, but I was just wondering if I know that this project is connected to Newberry and other libraries, but just wondering, if also we could find out if this was something, because I'm guessing it was something that was done, and so somebody would know. But I just throwing stuff out there.
Chris, it looks like somebody in the chat, somebody from Bronzeville Historical Society said they can look at the photo you're actually talking about. So I don't know if you want to put your contact information in the chat so they can reach out to you, or you can reach out to them.
Oh, cool. I'm driving. Did they put their info in the chat? I hit a red light, I'll put mine in there.
I don't think they have yet. I'm not sure if they're going to.
We do have contact information for Bronzeville Historical Society. It looks like they just put their Gmail address in the chat.
Yeah.
Okay, the ones with the cool picture. Okay. If I'm out, when you're driving and you want a red light and all lights are green, I'm in that situation. So
okay.
I will remember that it's Bronzeville Historical. If they have a website, I'll try and get to it.
Yeah.
Thank
definitely.
you.
Yeah, no problem. And I saw some people asked if it was going to be recorded, and Marsha answered it is going to be recorded and put up in the next couple of weeks. So I'll send out another email to everybody who registered with the link to that once it's up.
Tanya, this says Blanche Killingsworth from the Lawndale Historical Society. Thank you. I enjoyed that. I'm in the same position as the lady that just got off the phone. A photographer wife, he passed, sent me a box, 2 boxes of photos. And she thought it might have been in London, but it evidently was across the city that he shot pictures of different people. And I've been trying to do the same thing, find out who these people are. I've been taking, and I see now I shouldn't have, but taking them out with me when I did vending fairs to say, do you know these people? Which I won't do again, because you just informed me that was not is not a good mood to do with.
Well, you could even make copies of them and still bring them.
Yeah. So yeah, I think all of us collect a lot of things at times that we don't know where they come from or where they should go. But I thank you for your presentation this afternoon. It was very enjoyable and informative. Now, this presentation, are you going to send us a copy of it?
Yes. Once it's up on our YouTube page, I'm going to email everybody who registered with the link.
Okay, and then I can forward my board to that page as well. They can, yes, thank you.
Yes, of course. It looks like we're just about time. I don't know, Marcia, if you have any last words. I think I'm.
Sure, thank you so much, Tanya. Judging by the comments in the chat, everyone found this really informative and necessary information. So we definitely want to send a thank you to Tanya. And as Tanya mentioned, there is a feedback form link where you can give us feedback on this workshop, as well as you can use that feedback form to enter into the raffle to win an archival toolkit. Tanya, as our community engagement archivist, with funding from the Mellon Foundation, will be having more workshops in the next few months. So definitely continue to come back to the BMRC website, our newsletter, however you find out about us, social media. We'll have more information about the subsequent workshops that Tanya is planning. And we thank you for sharing some of your time with us.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Enjoyed it.
Have a great evening, everybody.